Set in rural Ohio, 1994, Sarah Mitchell, a 32-year-old schoolteacher, faces mounting persecution from her deeply religious small town of Millbrook after years of remaining childless in her marriage. When her husband dies in a car accident, the community's judgment turns vicious, believing her barrenness is God's punishment. Led by the tyrannical Pastor Elias Crane and a circle of sanctimonious women, they systematically destroy her life, stripping her of her teaching job, vandalizing her home, and eventually having her committed to a nightmarish asylum under false pretenses of mental instability. Enter Jakob Weaver, a 48-year-old former Amish man who stands nearly 7 feet tall, having left his community 20 years ago after questioning their rigid ways. Jakob now lives as a reclusive farmer on the outskirts of town. When he witnesses Sarah's persecution and eventual imprisonment, something deep within his conscience awakens. Despite his own painful past with rejection and isolation, Jakob embarks on a dangerous mission to expose the truth and free Sarah from her psychological prison. This is a story of two broken souls finding redemption in each other, set against the backdrop of religious extremism, small-town cruelty, and the power of unexpected love to heal the deepest wounds. The first snowfall of November 1994 settled over Millbrook, Ohio like a burial shroud, muffling the sounds of a town that had already grown too quiet around Sarah Mitchell. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the flakes drift past the glass, each one catching the amber light from her small chandelier before disappearing into the darkness beyond. Somewhere in that darkness, she knew they were watching. They were always watching now. "Sarah, honey, you need to eat something." The voice belonged to Margaret Hendricks, her only remaining friend in this God-forsaken place. Margaret sat at the worn wooden table, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 63, Margaret had seen enough of Millbrook's particular brand of righteousness to recognize the signs of a witch hunt brewing. Sarah didn't turn from the window. "Did you see Mrs. Cranston's face at the grocery store today? She actually crossed herself when I walked past the produce section." "Crossed herself, Maggie, like I was the devil incarnate." "People are scared," Margaret said softly, though her voice carried little conviction. "When they don't understand something, they destroy it." Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass, a ghost of the woman she'd been just 6 months ago. Her auburn hair, once carefully styled for her third-grade classroom, now hung limp around her pale face. Circles shadowed her green eyes, testament to nights spent lying awake, listening for footsteps on her porch, for rocks against her windows, for the whispered conversations of neighbors who had once brought casseroles when David was in the hospital. David. Even now, 4 months after the accident, she could barely think his name without her chest tightening. He'd been the buffer between her and this town's judgment, the proof that she was worthy of love, despite the empty cradle in their spare room. Without him, she was just the barren woman who'd failed in her most basic purpose as a wife. A sharp crack echoed through the house, and both women jumped. Sarah's heart hammered as she peered into the darkness, searching for the source. There, a teenage boy's silhouette darting away from her front porch, leaving behind the shattered remains of another thrown bottle. "That's the 3rd time this week," Sarah whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Margaret stood, her joints protesting audibly. "I'm calling Sheriff Bradley." "Don't." The word came out sharper than Sarah intended. "You know whose son that was. You know nothing will happen." Margaret's silence confirmed what they both understood. Tom Bradley attended Pastor Crane's church, where every Sunday the congregation prayed for God to cleanse their community of spiritual corruption. Where they whispered about Sarah Mitchell, the woman whose womb had rejected God's gift, whose husband had died in what was surely divine judgment. "Maybe," Margaret began hesitantly, "maybe it's time you considered Crane's offer. The counseling sessions, the prayer groups, if you showed them you were trying to..." "To what?" Sarah whirled around, her eyes blazing. "To repent for something I never chose. To beg forgiveness for a medical condition." She gestured wildly at the house around them. David and I tried for 8 years, Maggie. 8 years of doctors and tests and treatments that emptied our savings account and broke our hearts monthly. But none of that matters to them, does it? All they see is a woman who failed at being a woman. Margaret's face crumpled with sympathy, but Sarah wasn't finished. The words she'd been holding back for months came pouring out like water through a broken dam. Do you know what Pastor Crane said to me at David's funeral? While I was standing beside my husband's coffin, he leaned over and whispered that perhaps God was giving me a chance for a fresh start. A fresh start, Maggie? As if David's death was some kind of gift, some cosmic do-over for my broken body. The older woman reached across the space between them, grasping Sarah's trembling hands. Oh, honey, and the women. God, the women are worse than the men. Sarah's voice cracked. Linda Dawson actually suggested I was being selfish by staying in the house. David left me, said a childless woman doesn't need a 4-bedroom home when real families are looking for places to raise their children. Real families, Maggie, as if what David and I had wasn't real because we couldn't produce offspring. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and both women instinctively moved closer together. The isolation of Sarah's house, once a blessing that provided privacy for their grief, now felt like a trap. Situated at the end of Maple Street, with the nearest neighbor 200 yards away, it was the perfect location for the escalating harassment that had become Sarah's daily reality. There's something else, Margaret said quietly. Something I heard at the post office today. Sarah's stomach dropped. The post office in Millbrook functioned as the town's unofficial information exchange, where gossip spread faster than wildfire through wheat fields. Pastor Crane has been meeting with Dr. Morrison, Dr. Edwin Morrison. The name sent ice through Sarah's veins. Morrison ran the Millbrook Medical Center and had been David's doctor during his final weeks. More importantly, he was Pastor Crane's brother-in-law, and shared the man's rigid interpretation of moral duty. Meeting about what? Margaret's hesitation spoke volumes. Doris Fletcher was there when they came out of Morrison's office. She said they were talking about intervention and professional evaluation. Those were the exact words she heard. The room seemed to tilt around Sarah. She sank into the chair across from Margaret, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Intervention for what? I'm not sick. I'm not crazy. I'm just tired of being their scapegoat. But even as she said it, Sarah could feel the walls closing in. She recognized the pattern now, had read enough history to understand how communities dealt with women who didn't fit their narrow definitions of acceptable femininity. In Salem, they'd been called witches. In the Victorian era, they'd been labeled hysterical. In 1994, Millbrook, they were deemed mentally unstable. You could leave, Margaret suggested gently. Your teaching certificate would transfer. There are schools in Columbus, Cincinnati, places where nobody knows your story, where you could start over. Sarah stared at her friend, seeing the love and desperation in her weathered features. Margaret had been David's third-grade teacher 30 years ago, had watched him grow up, had celebrated when he'd brought Sarah home as his new bride. She was the closest thing to family Sarah had left in this world. Run away, you mean? Abandon the home David and I built together. Let them win. Sometimes tactical retreat is the wisest choice, Margaret said. There's no shame in protecting yourself. Before Sarah could respond, another sound cut through the night air, not breaking glass this time, but something far more chilling. Voices, multiple voices, growing closer, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps in the new snow. Both women froze, listening as the sounds approached Sarah's front yard. Through the window she could make out the flickering glow of flashlights, at least 6 or 7 beams cutting through the darkness. Sarah Mitchell, the voice that boomed across her yard, belonged to Pastor Elias Crane himself. We know you're in there. We've come to talk. Margaret grabbed Sarah's arm. Don't answer. They'll eventually. We're not leaving until you face us. Another voice, this one belonging to Tom Bradley. This community has been patient long enough. Sarah's mind raced. She could call 911, but Sheriff Bradley was Tom's father, and the entire police department attended Crane's church. She could hide, but they knew she was home. Her car was in the driveway. Lights were on throughout the house. "Mrs. Mitchell, we have witnesses who saw you at Miller's pharmacy today, asking questions about medications you have no business taking." Dr. Morrison's voice carried the authority of his medical degree and social standing. "Dangerous questions that suggest you're not thinking clearly. We're here out of Christian concern for your welfare." The lie hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been at Miller's pharmacy, but only to pick up the sleeping pills Dr. Morrison himself had prescribed after David's death. She'd asked the pharmacist quietly, privately, whether the dosage was correct because they weren't helping her sleep. Somehow that innocent question had been twisted into something sinister. "They're building a case," she whispered to Margaret. "They're actually building a case to have me committed." The flashlight beams moved closer to the house, and Sarah could make out at least 12 figures in her front yard. Men and women she'd known for years, people whose children she'd taught, whose church bake sales she'd contributed to. Now they stood in the snow like some medieval mob, ready to drag her from her home in the name of salvation. "Sarah Mitchell, if you don't come out voluntarily, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities," Pastor Crane announced. "Morrison has already signed the preliminary paperwork for a mental health evaluation. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Margaret's face had gone white. "Oh my God, they can't do this. This is America. It's 1994, not 1894. But Sarah knew better. She'd seen how small communities operated, how power structures functioned when righteous people convinced themselves they were doing God's work. She'd read about the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, the asylum system that had warehoused inconvenient women for generations. The tactics were older than civilization itself. "I need you to do something for me," Sarah said quietly, pulling a key from her kitchen drawer. "This opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Hamilton. Everything's in there: insurance papers, the deed to the house, my will. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen. I won't let them." "Maggie," Sarah gripped her friend's shoulders. "Look at me. These people aren't going to stop. They need a scapegoat, and I'm it. But maybe if I'm gone, they'll leave you alone. Maybe this madness will burn itself out." The voices outside were growing more agitated. Sarah could hear them arguing among themselves, debating the best approach. Some wanted to call Sheriff Bradley immediately. Others suggested waiting until morning, approaching through proper legal channels. But Pastor Crane's voice cut through the debate with frightening certainty. "The Lord has shown us a sign: David Mitchell's death, coming so soon after their latest failed attempt at fertility treatment. It's divine judgment, and divine judgment demands a response." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She and David had indeed undergone their final round of in vitro fertilization just 2 months before his accident. The procedure had failed, as all the others had, leaving them emotionally and financially devastated. But they'd told no one except Morrison, who had overseen Sarah's medical care throughout the process. "He's been sharing my medical records," she breathed. "Morrison's been telling them everything." The violation felt almost worse than the mob outside her door. For 8 years she'd endured the most intimate medical procedures, had subjected herself to tests and treatments that stripped away every shred of privacy and dignity. She'd done it all in hope, believing that someday the pain would be worth it. Now those private struggles were being used as weapons against her. A new sound joined the chaos outside: the rumble of a large engine approaching down Maple Street. Sarah peered through the window, watching as an enormous pickup truck slowed near her driveway. The vehicle was ancient, a battered Ford that looked like it had survived several decades of hard farm work. Behind the wheel sat a figure, so large he seemed to fill the entire cab. The truck stopped at the end of Sarah's driveway, but the engine continued running. The driver made no move to get out, simply sat there in the darkness, watching the scene unfold. "Who is that?" Margaret whispered. Sarah shook her head. She couldn't make out the driver's features, but something about his presence changed the dynamic in her yard. The voices grew quieter, less certain. Pastor Crane stepped toward the truck, his flashlight beam aimed at the windshield. "You need to move along," Crane called out. "This is church business." The truck door opened with a rusty creak, and the largest man Sarah had ever seen unfolded himself from the driver's seat. Even from a distance, even in the dim light, his size was staggering. He had to be nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of his truck. He wore work clothes, denim and flannel, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to being the biggest person in any room. "Jakob Weaver," Margaret breathed. "I haven't seen him in town for months." Sarah had heard whispers about the giant farmer who lived somewhere outside Millbrook, but she'd never seen him herself. The stories painted him as some kind of hermit, a former Amish man who'd been shunned by his own people and now lived alone on a failing farm. Looking at him now, standing in the swirling snow like some ancient Norse god, she understood why he'd become the stuff of local legend. "I said move along," Pastor Crane repeated, his voice carrying less authority now. Jakob Weaver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly up Sarah's driveway, his massive frame cutting through the mob of townspeople like a ship through water. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, carrying only a trace of the German accent that marked his Amish upbringing. "Seems like an awful lot of people for one small woman to handle," he said quietly. The crowd parted around him, suddenly uncertain. Whatever they'd planned for this confrontation, it hadn't included dealing with Jakob Weaver. He stopped just short of Pastor Crane, towering over the smaller man despite Crane's own considerable height. "This doesn't concern you, Weaver," Crane said, but Sarah could hear the nervousness creeping into his voice. "We're here on official business. Dr. Morrison has concerns about Miss Mitchell's mental state." Jacob's gaze swept over the assembled crowd, taking in their faces, their flashlights, their obvious preparation for some kind of intervention. When he looked toward Sarah's house, she had the strangest feeling that he could see her clearly through the window, could read the terror in her eyes. "Official business," Jakob repeated slowly, "in the middle of the night, with flashlights and a mob." He paused. "Consider funny how official business in this town always seems to happen in the dark." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, clearly hoping his medical authority would carry more weight than Crane's religious position. "Mr. Weaver, I understand your concern, but Miss Mitchell has been exhibiting signs of severe depression and possible psychosis. Earlier today, she made inquiries about medication that suggest she might be a danger to herself or others." The lie was so smoothly delivered, so professionally presented, that Sarah almost wondered if she'd misremembered her own conversation with the pharmacist. This was how it worked, she realized. This was how they turned reality inside out, until the victim began to doubt her own sanity. But Jakob Weaver seemed immune to Dr. Morrison's persuasive bedside manner. He studied the doctor with the same careful attention he'd given the rest of the crowd, as if he could see through to the man's true motivations. "What kind of medication?" Jakob asked. Morrison faltered slightly. "Well, that's confidential medical information, but I can assure you, you can assure me of nothing," Jakob interrupted, his gentle tone never changing. "Because if it's confidential medical information, you shouldn't be sharing it with this crowd in the first place." A murmur ran through the assembled townspeople. Sarah could see the doubt creeping into some faces, the recognition that perhaps their righteous mission wasn't as righteous as they'd believed. Pastor Crane tried to regain control. "Miss Weaver, I appreciate your concern, but you're interfering with God's work. This woman has brought spiritual corruption to our community. Her barrenness is a sign, her husband's death a judgment. We have a Christian duty to talk." Jacob's voice remained quiet, but there was steel beneath the gentleness now. To drag a grieving woman from her home in the middle of the night, to spread her private medical information like gossip, to decide that God's judgment needs your help. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for the explosion of anger she was certain would come. But Jakob Weaver simply stood there in the falling snow, a mountain of a man who seemed utterly unimpressed by their collective outrage. "I think," he said finally, that you all should go home. Talk to your God in private, like the Bible suggests. Leave this woman to grieve her husband in peace. You have no authority here, Sheriff Bradley said, stepping out from behind his son. This is police business now. Jakob turned his attention to the sheriff, and Sarah saw something flicker across his features. Not fear, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or old pain. Police business, Jakob repeated. Based on what crime? Being childless. Asking questions about medication. Grieving too long for your liking. He gestured towards Sarah's house, where she still stood frozen at the window. I see a woman whose only crime was loving a man who died too young. I see a community that's decided she's easier to blame than the God they claim to serve. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding the ground more interesting than Jakob's steady gaze. Furthermore, Jakob continued, I see a doctor violating his oath, a pastor forgetting his calling, and a sheriff abandoning his duty to protect the innocent. If this is God's work, then your God is smaller than I remember. Pastor Crane's face flushed red with fury. How dare you question? I dare because I've seen what happens when good people convince themselves that cruelty is righteousness. Jakob said, his voice carrying a weight of experience that silenced the pastor. I've seen communities tear themselves apart in the name of purity. I won't watch it happen again. He looked directly at Dr. Morrison. Whatever paperwork you think you have, whatever legal justification you've manufactured, it ends here. Tonight, this woman has done nothing wrong, except survive trauma in a way that makes you uncomfortable. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't remember when they'd started. For months she'd been drowning in a sea of judgment and condemnation, convinced that everyone in the world had conspired against her. Now, suddenly, impossibly, here stood someone willing to see her as a human being rather than a symbol of divine displeasure. The crowd was beginning to disperse, the righteous fire of their mission dampened by Jakob's quiet opposition. Some left reluctantly, muttering under their breath about interference and consequences. Others seemed almost relieved, as if they'd been swept up in something they didn't fully understand, and were grateful for an excuse to escape. Pastor Crane made one final attempt to salvage his authority. This isn't over, Weaver. Mrs. Mitchell still needs help, and this community won't abandon its Christian duty. Then help her by leaving her alone, Jakob said simply. Help her showing the compassion your faith supposedly teaches. Help her by remembering that judgment belongs to God, not to frightened people who need someone to blame for their own doubts. The pastor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Whatever response he'd prepared crumbled under the weight of Jakob's unwavering stares. Finally, with a gesture of disgust, he turned and stalked away, his remaining followers trailing behind him like deflated balloons. Within minutes, Sarah's yard was empty except for Jakob Weaver, who stood alone in the falling snow, looking up at her kitchen window. She stared back at him, this massive stranger who had just saved her from something she couldn't fully comprehend. Slowly, carefully, she raised her hand in a tentative way. Jakob nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that somehow conveyed more understanding than all the sympathy she'd received in the past 4 months combined. Then he walked back to his truck, climbed into the cab that barely contained his enormous frame, and drove away into the darkness, leaving Sarah and Margaret alone with their thoughts and the echoing silence of a crisis temporarily averted. Who was that man? Sarah whispered. Margaret shook her head, her face pale with relief and residual fear. I don't know, honey, but I think he just saved your life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the footprints of the mob that had gathered to destroy Sarah Mitchell in the name of righteousness. But it couldn't cover the memory of what had almost happened, or the growing certainty that this was only the beginning. Pastor Crane and Dr. Morrison wouldn't give up easily. They would regroup, find new approaches, new justifications for their crusade against the woman who represented everything they feared about a world where God's will wasn't as clear as they needed it to be. But for tonight, at least, Sarah Mitchell was safe, and somewhere in the darkness, a giant former Amish farmer was driving home with the image of her terrified face burned into his memory, wondering why her plight had awakened something in him that had been dormant for 20 years. The war for Sarah Mitchell's freedom was just beginning. 3 days after Jakob Weaver's intervention, Sarah Mitchell learned that salvation was often nothing more than a temporary reprieve. She discovered this truth at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when she opened her front door to retrieve the newspaper and found a manila envelope taped to her mailbox, her name scrawled across it in Pastor Crane's distinctive handwriting. Inside were photocopies of documents that made her blood run cold, medical records from her fertility treatments, bank statements showing the money she and David had borrowed for the procedures, insurance claims detailing every failed attempt at pregnancy over the past 8 years. Even more disturbing were the handwritten notes in the margins, observations about her mental state during appointments, comments about her obsessive behavior regarding pregnancy, speculation about her inability to accept God's will. The violation felt like being stripped naked in the town square. Every private moment of hope and despair, every intimate detail of her medical struggles had been documented, analyzed, and weaponized against her. "They're building a file," she whispered to herself, sitting at her kitchen table with the papers spread before her, like evidence at a trial. "They're actually building a psychiatric case." The phone rang, startling her from her horrified stupor. Margaret's voice on the other end carried an unusual tension. "Sarah, honey, don't go into town today. Promise me." "What's happened now?" "Pastor Crane held an emergency congregation meeting last night. Word is spreading that you threatened suicide at the pharmacy. That Morrison is concerned you might hurt yourself or others." Sarah's hands began to shake. "That's not true. I never said anything about suicide. I asked about sleeping pills because the ones he prescribed weren't working." "I know, honey, but the story's taken on a life of its own. Betty Morrison, that's the doctor's wife. She's been calling everyone saying her husband is afraid for the community's safety. That you might do something desperate." The web of lies was tightening around her with surgical precision. Sarah could see the strategy now. Isolate her completely, paint her as dangerous and unstable, then present institutionalization as the only compassionate option. It was brilliant in its cruelty. "There's more," Margaret continued reluctantly. "The school board met this morning. Emergency session. They're officially reviewing your teaching certificate, questioning your fitness to be around children. But I haven't taught since David died. I took leave. They're saying your leave was actually a suspension pending investigation. Principal Awakens is claiming you showed signs of instability during your last weeks at school." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering those final days before David's accident. She had been struggling, yes. 8 years of fertility treatments had left her emotionally exhausted. She'd been quieter in the teacher's lounge, less social at faculty meetings, but unstable, dangerous. The accusations were so far from reality that she almost laughed. "Almost. Maggie, I need you to listen carefully. If something happens to me, if they manage to have me committed, or if I just disappear, you need to contact the state authorities, not the local police." "The state." "Sarah, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared, because I'm starting to understand how this works. They're not just trying to punish me for being childless. They're trying to erase me entirely. Make me disappear so cleanly that no one will ever question what happened to the barren woman who brought shame to their godly community." After hanging up, Sarah forced herself to eat breakfast, though the food tasted like cardboard. She needed to stay strong, stay rational, stay ahead of whatever came next. But even as she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, she could feel the walls closing in. The first sign of escalation came at 10:30 a.m. A knock at her door, not the aggressive pounding of the mob 3 nights ago, but something far more sinister, the polite, professional rap of official business. Through the peephole she saw Sheriff Bradley and Dr. Morrison standing on her porch, accompanied by a woman she didn't recognize. The stranger was middle-aged, wearing a severe gray suit and carrying a briefcase. Everything about her screamed government authority. Sarah's heart hammered as she considered her options. She could refuse to answer, but that would only give them excuse to break down the door. She could try to escape through the back, but where would she go? Her car was in plain sight, and they'd undoubtedly thought to position someone behind the house. "Mrs. Mitchell?" Sheriff Bradley's voice carried forced politeness. "We need to speak with you. This is Miss Patricia Carlson from the County Mental Health Department." The official introduction made Sarah's stomach drop. They weren't here to threaten or intimidate anymore. They were here to take her. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to speak. "What do you want?" Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern that might have fooled someone who didn't know him. "Sarah, we're here because we're worried about you. Several members of the community have expressed concern about your recent behavior." "What behavior?" "I haven't left this house except to buy groceries." Miss Carlson consulted a folder in her briefcase. "Miss Mitchell, we have reports of erratic conduct, statements suggesting self-harm, and concerning inquiries about medication. Dr. Morrison has filed a petition for involuntary mental health evaluation based on his professional assessment of your condition." The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise what was happening. They were here to kidnap her legally, to disappear her into a system where her protests would be dismissed as symptoms of her illness. "I want to see a lawyer," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Sheriff Bradley shook his head. "Mrs. Mitchell, this isn't a criminal matter. This is a medical intervention. Dr. Morrison has the authority to order a 72-hour evaluation if he believes you pose a danger to yourself or others." "Based on what evidence?" Miss Carlson read from her folder with the dispassionate tone of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "Inquiries about lethal drug dosages, social isolation, refusal to seek appropriate counseling, aggressive behavior toward community members attempting to offer help." Each lie was delivered with such clinical precision that Sarah almost doubted her own memories. Had she been aggressive? Had her questions about sleeping pills somehow been twisted into inquiries about lethal dosages? "I'd like to call my friend Margaret Hendricks. She can verify." "Mrs. Hendricks has already been interviewed," Dr. Morrison interrupted smoothly. "While she expressed sympathy for your situation, she also confirmed our concerns about your mental state. She mentioned your paranoid beliefs about community persecution, your refusal to seek help, your recent statements about wanting to disappear." Sarah's world tilted sideways. Margaret had been interviewed? When? And what could she possibly have said that would support these accusations? "That's not," she wouldn't. "Mrs. Mitchell, this can be done cooperatively with dignity, or it can be done with the assistance of additional law enforcement." Miss Carlson said, checking her watch. "The choice is yours, but you are coming with us today." Through the numbness of betrayal and terror, Sarah became aware of another sound, the rumble of a large engine approaching down Maple Street. All four people on her porch turned to look as the same battered pickup truck from 3 nights ago pulled into her driveway. Jakob Weaver emerged from the cab with the same careful deliberation she remembered, his massive frame casting a shadow across her front yard, despite the overcast sky. He wore the same work clothes, faded denim and flannel, but Sarah noticed details she'd missed before. His dark hair, streaked with silver, was longer than fashion dictated, but clean and well kept. His face, weathered by years of outdoor work, carried lines that spoke of both hardship and unexpected kindness. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "Weaver, this is official business. You need to leave immediately." Jakob ignored him, walking straight up to the porch with that same unhurried confidence he'd displayed 3 nights ago. When he looked at Sarah, she saw something in his dark eyes that she hadn't seen in months. genuine concern for her well-being rather than professional obligation. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his worn baseball cap, "I was wondering if I might have a word with you about purchasing some of your late husband's farm equipment. I heard he had a tractor for sale." The lie was so smoothly delivered, so perfectly reasonable, that it took everyone by surprise. Sarah stared at him, understanding instinctively that he was offering her some kind of lifeline, though she couldn't imagine what good it would do. "David didn't have any farm equipment," she said carefully. Jakob nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Ah, I must have been misinformed. Perhaps I'm thinking of the Stevenson place." He looked around the group on her porch, his gaze settling on Miss Carlson. "Though it seems like you folks are having some kind of meeting, should I come back another time?" Dr. Morrison stepped forward, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Miss Weaver, as I explained before, this doesn't concern you. We're conducting official county business." "County business," Jakob repeated, his tone neutral. He looked at Miss Carlson again. "Ma'am, might I ask what department you represent?" Miss Carlson seemed taken aback by the direct question. "Mental health services. We're here to assist Mrs. Mitchell with accessing appropriate care." "I see." Jacob's expression remained perfectly calm. "And this assistance is being provided at her request." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see the officials exchanging glances, suddenly aware that their carefully orchestrated intervention was being scrutinized by someone who didn't seem intimidated by their authority. "Mrs. Mitchell is not in a position to make rational decisions about her care," Morrison said stiffly. "That's why the county has stepped in." Jakob turned his full attention to Sarah, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical presence. "Ma'am, do you feel you need mental health assistance?" The simple, direct question cut through all the bureaucratic doublespeak, like a knife through fog. For the first time in months, someone was asking for her opinion about her own life. "No," she said firmly, "I don't. And do you feel you pose a danger to yourself or others?" "No." Jakob nodded, then looked back at the officials. "Seems like the lady has made her position clear. On what grounds are you overriding her right to self-determination?" Miss Carlson's professional composure began to crack slightly. "Sir, the law allows for involuntary commitment when a licensed physician determines what specific behaviors has she exhibited that justify this action." Jakob interrupted. "Has she harmed anyone, threatened anyone, committed any crime?" "She's been asking about dangerous medications," Sheriff Bradley said, sounding less confident than before. "Sleeping pills prescribed by Dr. Morrison himself," Jakob pointed out. "Is it illegal to ask questions about medication your doctor gives you?" "She's been displaying paranoid behavior, claiming the community is persecuting her," Dr. Morrison added. Jakob gestured toward the group standing on Sarah's porch. "Is the community persecuting her?" The question was so direct, so uncomfortably accurate, that nobody answered immediately. Sarah could see the doubt creeping into Miss Carlson's expression, the recognition that perhaps this situation wasn't as clear-cut as she'd been led to believe. "Furthermore," Jakob continued, his voice still maddeningly calm, "I'm curious about the timing of this intervention. Mrs. Mitchell's husband died 4 months ago. If her mental state was truly dangerous, why wait until now to act? What changed?" Sarah knew what had changed. She'd refused to participate in Pastor Crane's counseling sessions, had declined to publicly repent for her childlessness, had failed to disappear quietly into shame and isolation. But she couldn't say that without sounding exactly as paranoid as they claimed she was. Jakob, however, seemed to understand the dynamics perfectly. Could it be that this intervention is less about Miss Mitchell's mental health and more about community pressure to remove an inconvenient reminder of life's unpredictability? Dr. Morrison's face flushed red. "How dare you question my professional judgment?" "I'm not questioning your medical skills," Jakob said mildly. "I'm questioning your motives. There's a difference." He turned back to Sarah. "Ma'am, do you have family? People who can advocate for you?" Sarah's throat tightened. "No. David was all I had. Friends, A lawyer. I thought I had friends, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The betrayal by Margaret still felt like an open wound. Jakob nodded grimly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Carlson, I assume you have protocols for situations where the subject of intervention has no family or legal representation. The county official shifted uncomfortably. Well, yes, but in cases where there's clear medical consensus. Is there clear medical consensus? Have multiple physicians evaluated Mrs. Mitchell, or is this based solely on Dr. Morrison's assessment? Miss Carlson's silence spoke volumes. Sarah realized that in their haste to remove her from the community, they'd cut corners, relied too heavily on local authority, and not enough on proper procedure. I think Jakob said quietly that Mrs. Mitchell deserves a second opinion from a physician who isn't related by marriage to the pastor calling for her removal. Don't you agree? The suggestion was reasonable, logical, and completely devastating to their carefully constructed case. Sarah watched as the officials realized their position was far weaker than they'd assumed. Sheriff Bradley made one last attempt to assert control. Weaver, you're interfering with official business. I could arrest you for obstruction. Jakob looked at him with something that might have been pity. Tom, your father was sheriff when I was growing up. He was a good man who understood the difference between law and justice. What would he think about what you're doing here today? The personal reference hit its target. Sheriff Bradley's father had indeed been respected throughout the county, known for his fairness and integrity. The son clearly fell short of that legacy, and Jakob's quiet reminder stung visibly. I suggest, Jakob continued, addressing the group but looking directly at Miss Carlson, that you return to your offices and follow proper procedures. File your paperwork through appropriate channels, allow Mrs. Mitchell to obtain legal representation and independent medical evaluation. Do this right if you're going to do it at all. Miss Carlson looked from Jakob to Sarah, to the other officials, clearly calculating the risks of proceeding versus the risk of retreat. Dr. Morrison, perhaps we should consult with the county attorney before moving forward. Dr. Morrison's face was purple with rage, but he recognized defeat when he saw it. This is highly irregular. Mrs. Mitchell's condition could deteriorate while we're dealing with bureaucratic delays. Then you should have followed proper procedures from the beginning, Jakob said simply. One by one, the officials retreated to their vehicles, their carefully orchestrated intervention derailed by one man's refusal to be intimidated. Sarah watched them leave with a mixture of relief and terror, knowing this was another temporary victory at best. When they were gone, Jakob turned to her with an expression of deep concern. Ma'am, they'll be back, and next time, they'll be better prepared. Sarah nodded, feeling oddly calm now that the immediate threat had passed. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Jakob was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant. I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control. I know what it's like when a community decides you don't belong, the Amish community. His smile was sad and complicated. Among others, Mrs. Mitchell, you need to understand something. These people aren't going to stop. They've invested too much in their narrative about you. They need you to be the villain in their story. Then what do I do? Jakob looked toward the road where the official vehicles were disappearing, then back at her. You survive, you document everything. You find people who will listen to truth instead of gossip. And you remember that their judgment of you says more about them than it does about you. He walked back toward his truck, then paused. Mrs. Mitchell? That friend of yours, Margaret Hendricks. I don't think she said what they claim she said. Might be worth having a conversation with her. Sometimes fear makes people appear to betray us when they're actually trying to protect us. Then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone on her porch with the echo of his words and the growing certainty that her war was far from over. But for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was fighting it entirely alone. Inside, the phone was ringing. She answered it with trembling hands. Sarah, thank God you're all right. Margaret's voice was thick with tears. They came to my house yesterday, asking all sorts of questions. They twisted everything I said, made it sound like I thought you were dangerous. I never said those things, honey. I never would. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling one small piece of her world click back into place. Jakob had been right. Fear had made her friend appear to betray her, when she'd actually been trying to protect her. But even as she accepted Margaret's explanation and felt grateful for Jakob's intervention, Sarah knew the fundamental situation hadn't changed. Pastor Crane, Dotterson, and their allies were regrouping, planning their next move. Next time, they would be more careful, more thorough, more devastating in their approach. The cage they were building around her was still there, invisible but closing tighter with each passing day. Jakob Weaver had bought her time, but time for what? To what end? As she hung up the phone and looked around her empty house, the house she'd shared with David, filled with dreams that would never come true, Sarah Mitchell began to understand that sometimes salvation required more than just temporary rescue. Sometimes it required someone willing to break the bars entirely. The tyrannical assault on Sarah Mitchell's life began in earnest, the following Monday, executed with the methodical precision of a military campaign. It started with the phone calls, dozens of them throughout the day, each one hanging up the moment she answered. Then came the mail, religious pamphlets about God's plan for barren women, fertility clinic advertisements with crude notes scrawled across them, and copies of articles about women who had committed suicide after losing their children. But it was the visit from the bank that truly showed Sarah how completely her world was collapsing. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm afraid there's been some concern raised about the mortgage payments," said Harold Wickham, the bank manager who had approved her and David's original loan 8 years ago. He sat uncomfortably in her living room, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by the rigid professionalism of someone delivering bad news. Sarah stared at him in confusion. "Harold, the mortgage is current. David's life insurance paid it off completely. I have the documentation right here." "Yes, well, that's part of the problem." Wickham shifted in his chair, avoiding her eyes. "There have been questions raised about your mental competency at the time those insurance decisions were made. Morrison has suggested that grief may have impaired your judgment regarding major financial decisions." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. "What are you talking about? I used David's life insurance exactly as we planned. We discussed it dozens of times. If something happened to either of us, the survivor would pay off the house and have a secure place to live. Be that as it may, the bank has received a formal request from the county mental health department to review any large financial transactions you've made since your husband's death. They're concerned that someone in your condition might be vulnerable to poor financial decisions or exploitation." Sarah's hands began to shake. "Are you freezing my accounts?" "Not freezing exactly, but we'll need to require secondary approval for any transactions over $500, just until your mental health evaluation is complete and you're cleared by appropriate medical authorities." The trap was closing around her with breathtaking efficiency. Without access to her own money, she couldn't hire a lawyer, couldn't travel, couldn't even afford to fight the very system that was imprisoning her. It was brilliant in its cruelty, using her husband's death benefits, intended to provide security, as evidence of her incompetence. "This is insane," Sarah whispered. "Harold, you've known me for 8 years. You know I'm not mentally incompetent." Wickham's face showed genuine discomfort. "Sarah, this isn't personal. The bank has to protect itself legally. If the county is raising concerns about your mental state, we have to take that seriously. If we allowed you to make major financial decisions while you were unwell, and something happened, we could be liable." After he left, Sarah sat alone in her living room, staring at the financial documents scattered across her coffee table. Every piece of paper represented another aspect of the life she and David had built together, now being used as weapons against her. The mortgage papers, the insurance policies, the savings account statements, all of it was being reinterpreted as evidence of her instability, rather than proof of her responsibility. The afternoon brought new horrors. The grocery store refused her check, claiming there had been issues with her account. The pharmacy informed her that Dr. Morrison had cancelled her prescription for sleeping pills, citing concerns about her medication-seeking behavior. Even the utility companies seemed to have been contacted. She received notices that her service would require new deposits due to changes in account status. By evening, Sarah understood that she was being systematically isolated from every support system, every resource, every avenue of independence. They were erasing her ability to function as an autonomous adult, creating exactly the kind of desperate situation that would justify their intervention. The realization brought with it a strange kind of clarity. This wasn't random persecution, born of grief-stricken religious fervor. This was a coordinated campaign, planned and executed with the kind of precision that required inside knowledge of legal and financial systems. Someone with considerable influence was orchestrating her destruction. The question was, who had that kind of power in Millbrook? The answer came at 9:30 p.m., delivered in the form of a black sedan that pulled into her driveway. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as a man in an expensive suit emerged from the passenger seat, followed by Pastor Crane and Dr. Morris. The driver remained in the car, but Sarah could see his bulky silhouette and the way the other men deferred to his presence. Her doorbell rang with the same polite insistence she'd learned to dread. "Miss Mitchell, this is County Commissioner Richard Blackwood," Pastor Crane announced when she opened the door. "He's here to discuss your situation." Sarah knew the name. Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in the county, a political kingmaker who had built his career on appealing to conservative religious voters. His involvement explained how her persecution had escalated so quickly and efficiently. He had the connections and influence to coordinate the kind of multi-system assault she'd been experiencing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "to what do I owe the honor?" Blackwood was a man in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of polished presence that came from decades of wielding power. His smile was warm and paternal, which somehow made him more frightening than Pastor Crane's obvious hostility. "Mrs. Mitchell, may I come in? I believe we need to have a frank conversation about your future." Against every instinct, screaming at her to slam the door, Sarah stepped aside and let them enter. Running would only delay the inevitable, and she needed to understand exactly what she was facing. Blackwood settled into David's favorite chair as if he owned it, his calculating eyes taking in every detail of the room. "You have a lovely home, Mrs. Mitchell. It would be a shame to lose it." The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that it took Sarah a moment to process it fully. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" "Threatening? Heavens no. I'm trying to help you understand the reality of your situation." He gestured toward Pastor Crane and Dr. Morrison. "These gentlemen have brought some serious concerns to my attention. Concerns about your mental health, your financial decisions, your ability to care for yourself." Sarah forced herself to remain calm. Concerns based on lies and fabricated evidence. Blackwood's smile widened. "That's exactly the kind of paranoid thinking they've been worried about. You see, Mrs. Mitchell, from the outside, your behavior appears increasingly erratic. The midnight confrontation with concerned community members, the hostile response to mental health intervention, the refusal to seek appropriate counseling after your husband's tragic death. Each point was delivered with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Sarah could see how her perfectly reasonable responses to unreasonable persecution could be twisted into symptoms of mental illness. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, there are financial irregularities that suggest poor judgment at best, possible fraud at worst. Large insurance payouts handled without proper oversight. Questionable decisions about property and investment. Every financial decision I've made has been completely legal and appropriate, Sarah said firmly. Perhaps, but the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging as actual wrongdoing, especially for someone in your vulnerable condition. Dr. Morrison leaned forward, his professional concern as polished as Blackwood's political charm. "Sarah, we're not here to punish you. We're here because we care about your well-being. The stress of David's death, combined with your long-standing fertility issues, has clearly taken a toll on your mental health. My fertility issues are medical, not psychological," Sarah snapped. Pastor Crane shook his head sadly. "That's where you're wrong, my dear. 8 years of rejecting God's will, of pursuing treatments that go against natural order, of refusing to accept your role in His plan, that kind of spiritual rebellion leaves deep psychological scars." The religious justification for her persecution was finally being stated openly. Sarah's childlessness wasn't just a medical condition, it was evidence of spiritual defiance that had somehow contaminated the entire community. Blackwood raised a hand to silence the pastor, his politician's instincts recognizing that too much religious rhetoric might undermine their position. "The point is, Mrs. Mitchell, that multiple systems have identified you as someone who needs help. The medical system, the financial system, the legal system, they're all expressing the same concerns. Systems you control," Sarah said quietly. "I prefer to think of it as systems I influence for the greater good of the community." Blackwood corrected, "And those systems have concluded that you need professional care in a structured environment." The euphemism couldn't disguise what he was really saying. They wanted to institutionalize her, to lock her away where her inconvenient existence couldn't challenge their narrow worldview. "What if I refuse?" Blackwood's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes grew cold. "Mrs. Mitchell, refusal isn't really an option at this point. Too many concerns have been raised, too much documentation has been filed. The county has a legal obligation to ensure your safety and the safety of the community." "I'm not dangerous. That's not for you to determine," Dr. Morrison interjected. "Mental illness often prevents patients from recognizing their own condition. Your inability to see the necessity of treatment is itself a symptom." The circular logic was maddening. Any protest she made would be interpreted as further evidence of her illness. Any rational argument would be dismissed as the cunning of a disturbed mind. They had constructed a perfect trap where sanity itself became proof of insanity. "However," Blackwood continued, "I'm a reasonable man. I believe in giving people choices, even when their options are limited, so I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to involuntary commitment." Sarah's heart jumped, despite herself. What kind of alternative? Voluntary admission to a private facility? Hillcrest Manor, about an hour from here. It's a much more pleasant environment than the state hospitals, and voluntary patients have significantly more rights and privileges. For how long? That would depend on your progress, your willingness to participate in treatment, your acceptance of appropriate medications and therapy. 6 months, perhaps. Maybe a year. 12 months of her life erased, of being drugged and analyzed and broken down until she accepted their version of reality. When she emerged, if she emerged, would she even remember who she'd been before? And if I choose the involuntary route? Blackwood's mask slipped slightly, revealing the cold calculation beneath his paternal facade. State facilities are much less comfortable. Treatment is more intensive, and the legal process for release is significantly more complex. Patients sometimes spend years trying to prove they're ready to rejoin society. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was the difference between a comfortable prison and a harsh one, between slow destruction and rapid annihilation. "I need time to think," Sarah said. "Of course, but not too much time. The county's petition for involuntary commitment will be filed tomorrow morning. If you're going to choose the voluntary option, you need to decide tonight." They rose to leave, their business concluded with the efficiency of men, accustomed to having their will imposed without question. Pastor Crane paused at the door, his hand on Sarah's shoulder in a gesture that might have seemed comforting to an outside observer. "Sarah, this is God's way of giving you a chance at redemption. Accept it with grace, and perhaps you'll finally find the peace that's been eluding you." After they left, Sarah sat in the darkness of her living room, surrounded by the ghosts of the life she'd built with David. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every small decoration told the story of their love, their hopes, their dreams of a family that would never exist. Now all of it was being used as evidence against her, proof that she'd lived a life outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable womanhood. Her love for David was obsessive, her grief was pathological, her childlessness was defiant, her very existence was a challenge to their ordered world. The phone rang, startling her from her dark thoughts. She almost didn't answer, expecting another harassing call, but something made her pick up. "Sarah?" Margaret's voice was tight with worry. "I just heard from Betty Morrison. She's telling everyone that you're being committed tomorrow. Is that true? They're trying to force me to commit myself voluntarily. If I don't, they'll have me declared incompetent and committed anyway." Margaret's gasp was audible. "There has to be something we can do. A lawyer, the state authorities, with what money? They've frozen my assets, and who would believe me over County Commissioner Blackwood and half the medical establishment?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of Sarah's impossible situation. Finally, Margaret spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do?" Sarah looked around her living room one more time, memorizing every detail of the home she was about to lose. "I don't know, Maggie. I honestly don't know." But even as she said it, she found herself thinking about Jakob Weaver, the giant man who had twice appeared at her darkest moments. He'd said she needed to survive, to document everything, to find people who would listen to truth. But how could she do any of that from inside an asylum? Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake catching the streetlight like tears from a weeping sky. Sarah watched it accumulate on her lawn, covering the footprints of the men who had just sealed her fate with their ultimatum. Somewhere in that falling snow, she knew, Jakob Weaver might be looking up at the same sky, perhaps thinking about the woman he'd tried to help, wondering if his intervention had been enough. It hadn't been. The bars of her cage weren't made of steel, they were made of laws and regulations, medical opinions and financial controls, religious judgment and political power. How did you break bars made of the very systems designed to protect you? As Sarah Mitchell prepared for what might be her last night of freedom, she couldn't have known that 20 miles away, a giant former Amish farmer was asking himself the same question. And unlike her, he thought he might have an answer. The snow continued to fall, covering Millbrook in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and pure, hiding the rot that festered beneath the surface of the community's righteous facade. But snow melted eventually, revealing whatever lay beneath. Sarah could only hope she'd survive long enough to see what remained when the spring thaw finally came. Sarah Mitchell's last morning of freedom began at 5:47 a.m., with the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, knowing that today would either mark her voluntary surrender or her forced capture. Either way, by sunset, she would be locked behind the walls of an institution, her life as she'd known it effectively over. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the commitment papers Blackwood had left behind. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the essential message was clear. By signing, she would admit to being mentally unstable and voluntarily relinquish her right to refuse treatment for an indefinite period. "Don't sign them," Sarah nearly jumped out of her skin at the voice. She spun around to find Jakob Weaver standing in her back doorway, snow-dusting his massive shoulders. She hadn't even heard him approach. "How did you get in?" "Back door was unlocked. Figured you might not answer the front after yesterday's visitors." He stomped the snow off his boots and closed the door behind him, his presence somehow making the kitchen feel smaller despite its spacious dimensions. "Saw the county cars here last night, assumed they weren't bringing good news." Sarah's hand went instinctively to her throat. "You were watching my house." Jacob's weathered face showed a flicker of something that might have been embarrassment. "Not watching exactly, but I've been keeping an eye on things. Had a feeling they weren't done with you. They've given me until noon to voluntarily commit myself to Hillcrest Manor. If I don't, they'll file for involuntary commitment to the state hospital." Jakob moved to the window, peering out at the street with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to watch for danger. "Neither of those things is going to happen." The quiet certainty in his voice made Sarah's heart skip. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, Jacob pulled out a kitchen chair, one of the sturdy oak chairs David had made during their second year of marriage, and lowered himself onto it with careful precision. Even sitting, he towered over the table, his massive frame making the furniture look like dollhouse pieces. Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you trust me? Sarah stared into his dark eyes, searching for some sign of deception or hidden agenda. She found only an intense sincerity that was almost overwhelming in its directness. This man who barely knew her, who had already risked his own safety twice to protect her, was asking for her trust in a world where everyone else had betrayed her. I don't even know you, she said softly. Fair point. My name is Jakob Weaver. I'm 48 years old. Born and raised Amish until I left the community 20 years ago. I've been living alone on a farm outside Millbrook ever since, mostly keeping to myself and trying not to cause trouble for anybody. He paused, his fingers drumming silently on the table. But I've also been watching what's happening to you, and it reminds me too much of things I've seen before. Things I swore I'd never let happen again if I was in a position to stop them. What thing? Jacob's expression grew distant, as if he was looking back across decades of painful memories. The Amish community I grew up in had its own ways of dealing with people who didn't fit, shunning, mostly. Cut you off from family, friends, everything you'd ever known. Make you disappear socially while leaving you physically present to serve as a warning to others. His voice carried the weight of personal experience. But sometimes, shunning wasn't enough. Sometimes the community decided that someone was truly dangerous to their way of life. When that happened, they had other methods, quiet methods, ways to make problematic people disappear entirely. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter morning. What are you saying? I'm saying that 20 years ago, I watched a good woman destroyed by people who convinced themselves they were doing God's work. She was different, challenged their assumptions about how women should behave. So they broke her down piece by piece until she couldn't remember who she'd been before they started. Jakob's eyes met hers directly. I was young then, and scared, and I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere. That the elders knew best, that God's will was being done. The pain in his voice was raw, immediate, as if the memory was still fresh after 2 decades. She died in that asylum, Sarah. Took her own life rather than spend another day being cured of the sin of being herself. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been carrying that guilt for 20 years, and I won't carry any more. Because what's happening to you is the same thing that happened to her, just with different words and different uniforms. And because this time, I'm not young and scared and powerless. Jakob leaned forward, his massive hands flat on the table. They're going to come for you today. Probably around noon, like they said. But they're expecting to find a broken woman who's given up hope, who'll come quietly rather than fight a battle she can't win. Aren't I? Not if you trust me. Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign that this was another trap, another manipulation designed to destroy what remained of her spirit. But Jakob Weaver's weathered features showed only grim determination and something she'd almost forgotten existed. Genuine compassion, without expectation of anything in return. What do you have in mind? First, we document everything. Every lie they've told, every law they've bent, every person they've pressured or threatened. Create a record that can't be buried or explained away. Jakob pulled a small tape recorder from his coat pocket. I've been gathering evidence for the past week. Conversations with people they've pressured, copies of documents they've filed, proof of the financial manipulations. But I need your testimony to tie it all together. Sarah stared at the device as if it were a loaded weapon. Even if we have evidence, who would we give it to? A federal civil rights lawsuit, violation of due process, gender-based persecution, abuse of medical authority, conspiracy to deprive civil rights. But we need to file before they have you declared legally incompetent. Sarah felt a chill. How much time do we have? Rebecca checked her phone. Based on the timeline Mr. Weaver provided, Probably less than 24 hours. Once you fail to appear for voluntary commitment, they'll fast-track the involuntary process. Emergency hearings, expedited psychiatric evaluation, the whole machinery of legal institutionalization. Then we need to move fast, Jakob said. For the next 4 hours, Sarah found herself at the center of a controlled hurricane of legal and journalistic activity. Rebecca conducted a formal interview, recording Sarah's testimony about every aspect of her persecution. Jakob provided supporting documentation for each claim. Phone calls were made to civil rights lawyers, federal investigators, and media contacts. By late afternoon, they had assembled what Rebecca called a bulletproof case for federal intervention. But they also had something equally important, a coordinated media strategy that would make Sarah's story public before her persecutors could silence her permanently. "The article will run in tomorrow's paper," Rebecca announced, closing her laptop. "Front page with documentation and corroborating sources. By the time Blackwood and his allies wake up, your story will be statewide news." "What about the legal case?" "Filed electronically an hour ago with the federal court in Cincinnati. Emergency injunction to prevent any involuntary commitment pending full investigation of civil rights violations. Judge Martinez is reviewing it now." Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope, real, substantial hope, based on facts and legal standing, rather than desperate wishes. "What happens now?" Jakob stood, stretching muscles cramped from hours of sitting. "Now we wait, and we stay hidden until we know the legal protections are in place." "You mean I stay hidden?" Sarah corrected. "Jakob, you've done enough. More than enough. You don't need to keep risking everything for me." His smile was sad, but determined. "Sarah, I told you about Ruth not just to explain my motivations, but to help you understand something important. When communities decide to destroy someone, they don't stop just because that person fights back. They escalate. They get more vicious, more desperate, more dangerous." Rebecca nodded grimly. "He's right. I've seen retaliation against women who tried to expose this kind of systematic abuse. Blackwood and his people have too much invested in their version of events to back down gracefully." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that breaking you out of their trap was just the beginning," Jakob said quietly. "The real fight starts now, and you're going to need people who understand that your freedom is worth whether it costs to protect it." As if to emphasize his point, the radio in the corner crackled to life with the sound of local emergency services chatter. Sarah caught fragments of the transmission. "Missing person, considered dangerous, statewide alert." "They're mobilizing everything," Jakob said, adjusting the radio frequency. "Sheriff's Department, state police, probably federal marshals by now. They're painting this as a mental health emergency, claiming you're a danger to yourself and others, because that's the only way they can justify the manhunt." Rebecca added, "If they admitted this was about forcing a sane woman into an asylum for non-conformity, they'd lose public support immediately." Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the empty landscape that had become her temporary refuge. Somewhere out there, dozens of law enforcement officers were searching for her, convinced they were hunting a dangerous mentally ill woman rather than helping to persecute an innocent victim. "I can't run forever," she said quietly. "No," Jakob agreed, moving to stand beside her. "But you don't have to run forever, just long enough for the truth to matter more than their life." The sun was setting over the frozen fields, painting everything in shades of orange and gold that reminded Sarah achingly of the sunset light that used to stream through her kitchen window. She was an exile from her own life, a fugitive from her own community, a stranger in a world where she'd once belonged. But for the first time in months, she wasn't alone. For the first time since David's death, she had allies who saw her as a human being worthy of protection, rather than a problem to be managed or eliminated. "Jakob," she said softly, not turning from the window, "tell me about her, about Ruth. What was she really like?" Jakob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried 20 years of love and loss and regret. "She was like you, Sarah. strong enough to survive things that would have broken other people, brave enough to stand up for what she believed was right, even when it cost her everything, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the light that came from inside her. He paused, his reflection visible in the dirty window beside her. She would have liked you, I think, would have recognized a kindred spirit. I wish I could have known her. Maybe in a way you do. Maybe every time someone refuses to let evil win, Ruth's spirit lives on a little. As night fell over their temporary sanctuary, Sarah Mitchell realized that her story had become something larger than her own personal struggle. She was fighting not just for her own freedom, but for every woman who had ever been told she was wrong for being herself. Every person who had ever been sacrificed to preserve someone else's idea of righteousness. The bars of her cage were broken now, but the people who had built that cage were still out there, still dangerous, still convinced that their cause justified any cruelty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new battles in a war that had been going on long before she was born and would continue long after she was gone. But tonight, in an abandoned farmhouse, with a gentle giant who carried 20 years of guilt and a fierce journalist who fought institutional corruption for a living, Sarah Mitchell was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman reclaiming her right to exist on her own terms. The hunt for her would continue, but she was no longer running in blind panic. She was moving with purpose, surrounded by people who believed in her worth and committed to ensuring that her voice would be heard above the lies of her persecutors. For Ruth, who had died 20 years too early. For David, who had loved her despite her broken body. For every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough exactly as she was. And for herself. Finally, after months of believing their version of who she was supposed to be. 1 year later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the nursery of her home, the room that had once been a shrine to broken dreams, now transformed into something entirely different. The walls that had been painted soft yellow in hopeful anticipation of a baby were now covered with photographs, letters, and drawings from the women whose lives had been touched by her story. There was Jennifer Walsh's wedding photo. She had found love again after healing from her trauma at Hillcrest. Maria Santos had sent a picture of herself graduating from college at 35, finally pursuing the education her family had tried to deny her. Dorothy Hanning's granddaughter had drawn a picture of Sarah with angel wings, with a note that read, "Thank you for giving my grandma her voice back." But it was the newest addition that made Sarah's heart overflow with an emotion she had never expected to feel in this room. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The letter had arrived that morning, written in the careful handwriting of a 12-year-old girl named Emma Peterson. "Dear Miss Mitchell, my mom says you're the lady who fought the bad men who hurt women for being different. I wanted you to know that because of what you did, my mom didn't have to go away when she got sad after my baby brother died. The doctors wanted to put her in the hospital, but my dad showed them the new laws about how they can't take moms away just for crying. My mom is better now, and she says it's because people like you made sure she could get real help, instead of being locked up. I drew you a picture of our family together. Thank you for keeping us together. Love, Emma." Sarah held the drawing, a stick figure family with smiles drawn in bright crayon, and felt tears streaming down her face. This was what victory looked like, not revenge against her persecutors, not even her own healing, but the knowledge that somewhere in Ohio, a little girl still had her mother because the world had changed just enough to protect vulnerable women instead of destroying them. "The van's here," Jacob called from downstairs. "You ready for this?" Sarah looked around the nursery one more time. In 30 minutes she would be speaking at the state capitol, advocating for the final passage of the Ruth Yoder Protection Act, comprehensive legislation that would prevent the kind of psychiatric abuse that had nearly destroyed her and countless others. After 12 months of testimony, investigations and legal battles, they were on the verge of creating systematic change that would protect future generations of women. But first, she had something important to do. From her jewelry box, Sarah retrieved the silver locket Jacob had given her at Ruth's memorial service. She opened it to look at the photograph of Jacob and Ruth, so young and full of hope. Then she closed it gently and hung it on a special hook she'd installed beside Emma Peterson's drawing. "I promise to keep fighting," she whispered to the photograph. "For you, for all of them, for every woman who will never have to face what we faced." Downstairs she found Jacob waiting in the kitchen, wearing the only suit he owned and looking distinctly uncomfortable in formal clothes. Margaret was there too, along with Rebecca Chen and 3 other survivors who would be testifying alongside Sarah. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, straightening Sarah's jacket with the maternal care that had sustained her through the darkest months of her life. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Sarah answered truthfully. The drive to Columbus took 2 hours, during which Sarah reviewed her notes and tried not to think about the significance of what they were attempting. The Ruth Yoder Protection Act would be the most comprehensive mental health reform legislation in Ohio's history, establishing strict protocols for involuntary commitment, mandatory second opinions, and severe penalties for abuse of psychiatric authority. More importantly, it would create a presumption of competence. The radical idea that adults should be considered capable of making their own decisions, unless proven otherwise, beyond reasonable doubt. "Nervous?" Jacob asked, as they pulled into the Capitol parking garage. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but the good kind of terrified. The kind that means you're about to do something that matters." The hearing room was packed with survivors, advocates, journalists, and legislators. Sarah saw Morrison in the back row. He had been released, pending appeal of his conviction, but had lost his medical license permanently. Pastor Crane was nowhere to be seen. He had fled the state, rather than face federal charges. Blackwood was serving 2 years in federal prison, his political career destroyed by the scandal. But Sarah barely noticed her former persecutors. Her attention was captured by the faces in the front rows, dozens of women who had traveled from across the state to witness this moment, women who had found their voices because she had refused to be silenced. When Sarah's name was called, she walked to the witness table with steady steps. The prepared speech in her hands contained statistics about psychiatric abuse, legal precedents for reform, and carefully crafted arguments for legislative change. Instead, she set it aside and spoke from her heart. "Honorable legislators, 1 year ago I was a grieving widow, living quietly in a small town, trying to heal from the loss of my husband, while dealing with the disappointment of never having children. I wasn't bothering anyone. I wasn't hurting anyone. I was simply trying to exist as myself, imperfect, sad, but fundamentally sane. A group of powerful men decided that my grief was inconvenient, my childlessness was shameful, and my refusal to pretend otherwise was dangerous. They tried to erase me from existence by declaring me mentally ill and having me locked away, where my inconvenient truth could never challenge their comfortable lies. They almost succeeded. If not for the courage of one man who refused to let history repeat itself, if not for journalists willing to investigate corruption, if not for federal authorities willing to prosecute abuse of power, I would be in a psychiatric facility right now, drugged into compliance and forgotten by the world. But I'm not here today to talk about what was done to me. I'm here to talk about Emma Peterson, a 12-year-old girl whose mother was almost taken from her for the crime of grieving too openly. I'm here to talk about the hundreds of women still trapped in facilities like Hillcrest, women whose only illness is their refusal to be smaller than they are. The Ruth Yoder Protection Act isn't named after me, and it shouldn't be. It's named after a woman who died 20 years ago because no one was brave enough to protect her right to be herself. Ruth Yoder was brilliant, compassionate, and utterly sane. She died in an asylum because powerful men found her inconvenient. We cannot bring Ruth back. We cannot undo the damage done to the hundreds of women who have suffered similar fates. But we can make sure that Emma Peterson's mother comes home every night. We can make sure that no woman is ever again caged for the crime of being human in ways that make other people uncomfortable. This legislation isn't about mental health policy. It's about the fundamental human right to exist as yourself, even when yourself doesn't fit neatly into someone else's expectations. It's about the right to grieve, to question, to struggle, to be imperfect, and to do all of these things without losing your freedom. I ask you to pass this bill, not just for the women in this room, but for every little girl who will grow up in a world where being different doesn't make you dangerous, where being strong doesn't make you sick, and where being yourself is never a crime punishable by imprisonment. The silence that followed was profound, broken finally by applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Sarah looked out at the faces in the audience and saw tears on cheeks, hope in eyes, and the kind of determined resolve that changes history. The bill passed unanimously. 3 months later, Sarah stood once again in her transformed nursery, this time holding a different kind of letter. It was from the Yoder family, Ruth's parents, now in their 80s, who had driven from Pennsylvania to attend the bill signing ceremony. Dear Sarah, we wanted to thank you for giving our daughter's death meaning. For 20 years we have carried the pain of losing Ruth to forces we couldn't understand or fight. We thought her story ended with tragedy, that her beautiful spirit had been extinguished for nothing. You have shown us that Ruth's story continues in every woman you have helped, in every law that now protects the vulnerable, in every little girl who will grow up free to be herself because you refuse to be silenced. Our Ruth lives on in the work you do. She would be so proud to know that her name has become synonymous with protection, instead of persecution, with justice instead of tragedy. Thank you for proving that love is stronger than hate, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that one person's courage can light candles that burn for generations. With gratitude and love, Samuel and Mary Yoder. Sarah sat in the rocking chair David had built during their 2nd year of marriage, surrounded by the evidence of lives transformed by courage and compassion. Outside her window, spring was blooming in the garden. David had planted flowers returning to life after a long winter of dormancy. Jakob found her there an hour later, tears of joy streaming down her face as she read and reread the Yoder's letter. Good tears? He asked gently. The best tears, Sarah replied. The kind that wash away old pain and make room for new hope. Jakob settled into the chair beside her, a chair he'd built himself to match David's, creating a space where they could sit together as partners in their shared mission, without betraying the memory of the love that had brought them to this moment. I have news, he said quietly. The foundation received a call today from a woman in Kentucky. Her story sounds familiar: religious community, powerful men, accusations of mental instability for not conforming to expectations. Sarah felt the familiar stirring of purpose, the call to action that had become as natural as breathing. When do we leave? Tomorrow, if you're ready. But Sarah, Jakob paused, his weathered face serious. This work we do, it's never going to end. There will always be another woman who needs help, another community that needs changing, another battle that needs fighting. Sarah looked around her nursery, her memorial to broken dreams, transformed into a sanctuary for renewed hope. On the walls hung the faces of women who had found their voices, children who had kept their mothers, families that had stayed together because the world had become just a little bit safer for people who dared to be different. I know, she said softly, and I can't think of anything I'd rather spend my life doing. As the sun set over Millbrook, Sarah Mitchell, survivor, advocate, protector of the vulnerable, prepared to carry her light into another community where darkness had taken root. She was no longer the broken woman who had nearly been destroyed by others' hatred of her differences. She was the answer to Ruth Yoder's 20-year-old prayer for justice. She was Emma Peterson's guardian angel. She was living proof that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in soil that has been broken apart and remade by love. The cage they had tried to build around her had become a foundation for freeing others. Her childlessness had made her mother to hundreds of women who needed protection. Her brokenness had been transformed into a strength that could heal wounds across generations. In the gathering twilight, Sarah Mitchell smiled and began planning her next rescue, because that's what angels do. They show up when darkness seems overwhelming. They stand with the vulnerable when everyone else walks away. And they prove that love really can triumph over the forces that try to cage the human spirit. Somewhere in the fading light, she could almost see David's approving smile and Ruth's grateful tears. And she knew that every battle she would fight, every woman she would help, every law she would change, was a love letter written to all the broken hearts that had made her whole.